Um, I also thank the Ontario Nature for the opportunity, and I thank Brian for introducing this idea of a webinar. It's completely new to me. I do a lot of talks, but I see the faces of the audience, and now I'm looking at a screen, and it's a little bit disconnected. So anyway, I'm excited to talk about some of the work that I've been doing actually for 50 years, and talk about rivers in general as it pertains to a really good environmental tool that I found that works, has been applied to many issues and perspectives. So Dan asked about, I'm going to go back to the beginning. Dan asked about the the photograph on the cover page here. That's actually my wife, Andrea, hoisting the 85-pound ABS canoe on around a waterfall on the Collonges River last November. We were asked to put in some thunder boxes for Friends of the Des Moines River, and which includes the Collonges River, the Noir, and the Des Moines. I'm sure people who are watching this have either heard of that or paddled these great rivers. And it was our pleasure to have been a part of that project. Okay, Dan, you want to go to the next slide for me? So just going back in my own history, why am I so passionate about rivers? And I just have to say a couple of things. When I was a young lad growing up in the Peterborough area, we had a cottage, one of the first cottages built on Clear Lake, as a matter of fact. My father in the 1950s was making survival shows for the Department of Lands and Forests, and he had conscripted the help of some of the elder woodsmen from the Curve Lake First Nations Reserve, and we spent a lot of time with one of the woodsmen, and he taught me how to navigate in the forest without any technical aids, paddle a canoe, and certainly my interest in anything First Nations at that time really, I think, spawned a seed in my head that all I wanted to do was canoe and explore, and that was what kicked off my interest. It's certainly in a combination of learning more about our First Nations and paddling our first waterways. Dan, you want to go to the next slide too? It's not working on my side. So in the context of Ontario rivers, I know, as Dan mentioned, I think there's something like 8,000 rivers in Canada, not including some of the smaller tributary rivers and creeks, but 100 rivers doesn't seem like a lot in that context. But with regards to Ontario, we've got in the guidebooks and the mapping that I've done, you can see the general areas that I've isolated, starting from the west to Woodland Caribou Provincial Park on the Manitoba border. Certainly we worked on the Trans-Canada Trail, 1,200 kilometers from Thunder Bay to Manitoba. Missinaibi River, there was a lot of history there, that as far as guidebook writing goes, with just an interpretation of our topographic map system and how it's not geared to recreational travel in wilderness areas. Temagami, my home area and where I started working as a park ranger back in '76, and mapped out the Temagami book at that time. We'll get into that later. Ottawa Valley Rivers, that started as a single river guide for the Des Moines River, which at that time was being heavily used. There were 500 parties a year going into that river out of the Swisha, just near Deep River. So expanded that book. It covers some of the Ontario rivers, and then predominantly the three main rivers, what they call the three sisters now, Des Moines, Noir, and Collonges rivers, and Muskoka. I moved to Muskoka from the Temagami area over 20 years ago, and we made our home here. And one of the first things I did was map out the pockets of wilderness. And if you can believe that, in Muskoka, it's known for its $1 million mansions and cottages and tour boats and golf courses. There were beautiful places, untouched, and which also needed protection at the time too. Okay, Dan, next slide, please. Starting with Temagami. This is the first book that I produced for the Ontario government at the time, and it was an interesting project for me. It was the first job I ever had, first job I've ever had where I get a steady paycheck. I thought I had died and gone to heaven at the time. It was just great to be able to map out, chart out such a large area, 10,000 square kilometers, Temagami district, and actually get paid for it. And what sparked that was I had already canoed in Temagami since the early 1970. 1969-70 was my first trip there. I paddled for 5 months of the year, taking notes and illustrations. I was doing a lot of sketching at the time. Also noticed the encroachment by industry on some of the remote canoe routes. And I also was learning at that time about the Nastagan, the ancient paddling routes or canoe routes used by the Temagami Missinaibi and prehistoric peoples in this area. Artifacts had been found dating back 5,000 years within that Temagami district. You can see, before I even knew about the Nastagan, I had mapped out what looked to be a concise canoeing region, much like Algonquin Park. The map on the right was the area mapped out back in 1977. It almost mirrors the Nadaki Manan, which is the traditional territory of the Temagami Anishinaabe people. Next slide there, please, Dan. As far as the size of the wilderness area of Temagami goes, you can see the size of Algonquin Park superimposed over Temagami. One of the difficult things about when I was asked by the ministry to map out the Temagami district canoe routes, was the fact that Temagami is a town, it's a village. Temagami is a lake, a large lake. Temagami is an administrative district, but Temagami is also Nadaki Manan, which is the traditional canoeing area. And the Nastagan routes, covering 4 administrative districts, 3 of which did not want to take part in the mapping of these routes, mainly because of the encroachment of logging interest. They didn't want to have to maintain canoe routes. And at the time we were losing portages, they were being cut over. There's no protection for our indigenous trail systems, and still isn't actually in this province or country. Next slide, please, Dan. Thanks. So people always ask, what's so special about Temagami? And why was I interested in mapping out the several rivers, beautiful rivers in Temagami? And basically, you can spend a whole summer or 2 summers or 3 summers paddling different river systems. And the prehistory, according to the legends and the mythologies that I've researched in Temagami, really gives license to the preciousness of special places in our province. Temagami, certainly you can see in this picture, the high country, the towering white pines, the old growth forest. It contains the last remnants of the red and white pine stands in Ontario. And we were lacking throughout the, well, up until the environmental movement in the late 1970s and early 80s, that the government and industry were held accountable for the mismanagement of our forests. Next slide, please, Dan. So the old growth forest is kind of an iconic image that people know or associate with Temagami, and not just Temagami, but across the northern sector of Lake Huron over towards Sault Ste. Marie. Some of the last beautiful stands of red and white pine, as you can see here. And Ontario at the time, if you go back in the history of the management of our forests, and I worked for the government for almost 10 years in Temagami, and was associated with mostly lands and parks, sometimes fish and wildlife, but I also kept an eye on what was going on in the timber branch. It was a case where mostly one office department didn't know what was going on with the other, the left hand not knowing what the right hand was doing, so to speak. Timber seemed to have carte blanche at the time, and the environment movement certainly turned a lot of heads. I know we approached the movement, as I mentioned in the last webinar, on a sort of philosophical and emotional basis. You know, we love trees because they're beautiful and we love to hug them. Didn't really stand a chance with the government and the industry that knows exactly what the stump value is for each individual tree. So we had to change our tactics to, well, there's also the indigenous rights to traditional lands, more of a conservation ethic, and certainly the fact that cultural tourism, nature tourism, ecotourism, adventure tourism, all have a right to play as far as non-timber values go. So there's a huge importance for the old growth in Temagami. Next slide, please, Dan, thanks. So the Rock Knob uplands of Ontario, these high ridges are the highest in Ontario. This is Maple Mountain, and this actually kicked off the environment movement, which got me interested in the movement back in 1972. Same year that Greenpeace, Paul Watson, Bob Hunter formed the organization Greenpeace, which we all know of today on the West Coast. So things were happening here. We didn't quite get the press as they did out on the West Coast, but it was happening here in central Canada. Maple Mountain was it's not the highest, but it's one of the highest. It has probably the best view hiking trail off of one of the canoe routes, certainly one of the best views in the province. And the Ontario government proposed a international ski hill back in 1972, without regards to the fact that Chebejing, or place where the soul spirit dwells, was a traditional burial place for the Temagami Missinaibi people. So that sort of hit the fan and started a lot of ad hoc meetings, group formations, Save the Maple Mountain Committee, and so on and so forth. So the protection of these high points with a lot of traditional values for our First Peoples, not just for burial sites, for vision questing, and all of their legends, a lot of their legends are based around these high points. Next slide, Dan, please, thanks. So the beauty of Temagami and a lot of these river systems, they're pool and drop rivers across the lower Canadian Shield throughout, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and then up into the lower tree line. Beautiful rivers, pool and drop rivers, beautiful lakes intermixed with fast flowing rivers, and certainly a paddler's paradise. And a lot of these routes still are unprotected. And that's one of the reasons why I started doing guidebooks, is I knew that, having worked with the government, I know that once the public has information on, say, a river or a trail, and they start using it, it gives us a little bit more power, a little more persuasive power when it comes to the management of a particular resource. Next slide, please, Dan. Temagami, if you know Temagami, you'll see a lot of Anishinaabe names, and they've removed a lot of the names because people either could not pronounce it, and they didn't want to translate a lot of the names. And when you look at the work done, say, by Craig McDonald on his Aboriginal trail map or Nistagan map, incredible amount of work that he put into naming all of the rivers and lakes in the Temagami district, and certainly to translate some of these names, like the Anishinaabe names tell a story, and like Lady Evelyn was haunted the Moose, Florence Lake, lake that bends in the middle. This picture denotes the south branch of the Lady Evelyn, which is quite shallow, and you have to kind of jerk off the shallows and the fallen logs, and they call this Tungedi, which means asshole pointing backwards. So you see how representative of the names to the geography, the environment of the place. And they also had a sense of humor when they were naming some of these places. Next slide, please, Dan. In the background, you can see this is the Spirit Rock, and it's an age-old, one of the most spiritual sites in all of Ontario, perhaps even Canada. And it's you can see one of the elders here, Alex from the Temagami, Missinaibi, and being interviewed by Bob Hunter from Greenpeace. Actually, he's working with City TV at this time and doing a lot of environment work. We're getting the camera crews out to paddle some of the controversial rivers and lakes in Temagami at the time. Next slide, Dan, thanks. So had a chance to put the canoe book together, and it sold out first year, and I took over the publication of it after that, and we're now going into the 14th printing of the Temagami book. We keep it updated with regards to new routes. We try to get a lot of the new routes in, based on Craig McDonald's Muskoka map, and mostly to get the protection of some of these smaller routes. A lot of, when they created the park in Temagami, and I worked on the first park boundaries with the land planner, but it was thrown out because it took too much of the timber resource away from industry. And it was sad because only 10% of the First Nations archaeology had been actually been researched in the district. Only a small portion of that, as I say, 10%. Not only that, but we're also losing a lot of precious areas, especially around the wilderness park. So they actually added conservation reserves and waterway parks to the main core park later, but left a lot of donut holes in that area. We're now trying to increase the size of that park. Next slide, please, please, Dan. So mapping out the rivers and lakes of Temagami, the first 2 years I worked as a ranger, they didn't give us a chainsaw. A lot of the work opening up these historic and prehistoric Muskoka trails hadn't really been cleared out since the canoe patrol days back in the 1920s and 30s. So they didn't give us a chainsaw the first 2 years. Everything had to be chopped out by hand. So it was one of the most difficult jobs. As a trail builder, we do some pretty hard work as it is now, but back then with just axe work for some of these big trees over the portages was tremendous work. Next slide, please, Dan. Thanks. And we would almost be chastised by our supervisors, because in the past the canoe program didn't have a lot of respect, and now that it was that we're set to maintain these routes, it really, I would have to say, put the fear into the logging industry, because now we had all of these linear routes that had no protection, and now we had the basic protection status that that was advertised in the guidebook. And it also spread the traffic out, because back in the mid-1970s, the only park in Temagami was the Lady Evelyn River Park, Waterway Park. And it was actually busier back in the late 70s and early 80s. And that one reason why mapped out the much larger area was to spread out that user traffic, because people tend to love things to death, as we all know. And that park was much too small. And we're finding that today. Our park systems are way too small to handle the influx of outdoor travelers. Next slide, please, Dan. Thanks. Yep, that's me with no life jacket. We never wore life jackets because they were heavy. They were made of kapok, which got waterlogged. We just shoved them under our seats. And I got in trouble putting this on Facebook not too long ago. What kind of influence are you sending out to people not wearing a life jacket, paddling fast water? Anyway, next slide, Dan. So even today, we're watchdogging what's going on in Temagami. There's a lot of continued clear-cut logging, and that's part of what we're trying to. Our own environment group, Earth Roots, is doggedly trying to protect areas mostly surrounding the wilderness park, which is being eaten away slowly but steadily. Next slide, Dan. Cartoon that friend Bill Mason's son, Paul, great cartoonist, put together just for fun. So the next guidebook I was interested in, certainly the Missinaibi guidebook, and that happened after my wife and I were paddling, looking at the Missinaibi as we were running an outfitting company at the time in Temagami, and looking at the Missinaibi as one of our tour trips that we would do on a regular basis. We actually paddled over a dead body on one of the rapids, and the search and rescue people had just arrived, and the body had been there for some time. We didn't know until we got out that, and then I started checking on the number of deaths on the Missinaibi, and there were over 30 deaths within a decade. And that took me to the Ontario Coroner's Office, and I did research onto third-party reports, police reports on why people were perishing on this river. And it turned out that I think there were almost 20 mistakes on the topographic map series that had to be corrected. Falls that weren't marked on, rapids in the wrong places, portages, certainly like Thunderhouse Falls, which took the life of 5 people, was something to be concerned about, as far as the fact that that Ontario government was advertising the Missinaibi as a waterway park and a heritage river to an international market. And also the maps themselves. Thunderhouse Falls was actually updated in the 1970s when Hydro wanted to put a power dam in at Thunderhouse Falls, and they marked the portage on the wrong side of the map, and a place where you just can't get to. 5 people died as a result of that. So that was important to me personally. Hit a sore spot, because the government is basically trying to sell a product that's not safe, and it hasn't been researched enough. And I pitched a story to the Toronto Star at the time. And you want to hit the next slide, please, Dan? Thanks. And next one, also the next slide. Toronto Star took interest in this story, and they flew up to. I was wintering up in Muskoka and doing some research at the reserve there, the First Nations Reserve, Muskoka, and writing my Missinaibi book. They took an interest in the story, and the writer that came up spent 2 or 3 days with me going over this information. I had actually found the camera from these people that drowned in the river, and got permission from the family to reproduce some of these pictures. And the writer from the Star said that he had been deluged with phone calls and letters from people who said that they had close calls, and they understood that was a real problem with the river. Interesting. I when I was looking for funding to do my research and publish the book, I got no help from the Ministry of Natural Resources until this article came out, front page in the Toronto Star, and I was called to Peterborough, and I was handed a check for $10,000, basically not to keep quiet, but to put towards the finishing of my Missinaibi guidebook project. Next slide, please, Dan. Thanks. Thunderhouse Falls, you can see it's a very treacherous place. Even in the summertime, waters can rise up to 6 to 8 meters just overnight. It's one of these rivers in the boreal area that, if there is a lot of maybe 2-3 inches of rain in the upper sections, the upper sections will release in 24 hours and then flush down the lower section. And anybody with a canoe on the shoreline may find it floating downriver in the morning. And interesting, you usually only see this on dammed rivers, but this is a natural happening on, especially at Thunderhouse, where the river actually hits a break in the canyon there. Next slide, please, Dan. Classic portage around Hell's Gate on just below Thunderhouse Falls. I'm sure people who have canoed the Missinaibi or other places can certainly familiarize this kind of portage work. Next slide, Dan. You know, I mentioned earlier that the Des Moines River was getting really busy, and I thought, well, this is time to rework the Ottawa Valley canoe routes. And this actually took in all the rivers in the upper section on the Ontario side, including Temagami rivers flowing out of two main rivers. All of the rivers in Temagami flow out of either the Montreal. Well, actually, they all flow out to the Ottawa Valley, except for the lower section, which flows out into Lake Nipissing via the Temagami and Sturgeon rivers. This was an interesting project, and what I really enjoy about this is delving into the First Nations history and the mythologies that are part and parcel of the landscape here. For example, in Chalk River, where one of the first, I guess, the first nuclear power plant station was established, at Chalk River, the First Nations feared this demon that resided there. It was in the shape of a fireball, things like that. Just a coincidence that they built this, established this nuclear plant there, on the very place where the native people would not typically go anywhere near. Next slide, please. Yeah. I could go into lengths about the Manitoba or the Quebec rivers that I mapped out. But in the context of Ontario, I'm just trying to keep most of the focus on Ontario. Manitoba spent 4.5 years, I guess almost 5 years, mapping out 19 rivers in Manitoba for an adventure, working with Canada Parks and the Manitoba Tourism and Natural Resources Ministries to document 19 rivers. Each river that I picked out had something going on environmentally, whether it was rerouting waters from the historic Hayes River into the Nelson, to power line intrusions, roads, lost in the sensitive areas around Woodland Caribou Provincial Park. And certainly in the 4 years that I did the field research, I only saw maybe less than a dozen people on any of these routes. And one of the key things was to get people out and using these traditional waterways to ensure their protection. And since the book's been out, it's been invaluable for river protection in that particular province. Next slide, please, Dan. Dan, are you there? Aha. We're talking about First Nations use of the Nistagan, or Onagum, as it's better known, especially Northwest Ontario. This is actually in Ontario. It's got Artery Lake, and it's interesting that a lot of the headwaters of the river systems flowing into the east shore of Lake Winnipeg actually start in the province of Ontario, in and around Woodland Caribou Park. That's the thing with the guidebooks, is that I looked at it as rivers without borders, and certainly our First Nations had no notion of no trespassing signs, fences, or administrative boundaries. And this is one thing that I looked at when mapping out the Manitoba rivers, is the fact that, you know, part of these rivers are in Ontario. This is Artery Lake, one of the best pictograph rock painting sites probably in Canada. Next slide, please, Dan. Thanks. Dan, are you there? Oh, thanks. Unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, that we have a tendency to love things to death. And that's one of the things that, as a researcher, explorer, I come across a lot of more now than ever, and that's probably the last decade, desecration of these teaching places. These are special places that you weren't actually supposed to go to these places without specific permission from the shaman teacher, and certainly not without leaving some kind of offering. And I've seen more of this desecration, and I think because just that these places are more accessible. So, you know, roadless wilderness has always been an important facet of conservation and protectionism. Interesting to note, in Manitoba on the Grass River, saw two names written across really, 1,000-year-old rock painting sites. The two perpetrators actually died within a month of writing names on the rock wall, one in a car accident, one in a mining accident. And whether that's the importance of these are found through our remote places, wilderness areas, and places now that are not quite so remote. Next slide, please, Dan. Dan, next slide.
It's I have
You there, Dan?
I have moved to the next slide, but I'm not sure if you can see that. Hi, Hap. I think there's maybe a network slowdown or something. Can you see the next slide?
Okay. Go back one.
Back one.
Yes.
That's it.
Back one. That's not moving. Nope. Go back another one.
Muskoka, naturally.
Nope. It's not. Yeah, you got to go right back to where the Muskoka one was.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're having a network problem of some sort, so it might be a little sluggish.
That's good there. So why Muskoka? I moved to Muskoka over 20 years ago, and first thing I noticed that there were at least 12 rivers in Muskoka, and a lot of these did not have a lot of protection status, or a lot of people just didn't know about them. And it was one of the projects I did, was to explore these pocket systems that all out of and run through the North and South Muskoka rivers and the Black River, eventually into Georgian Bay. Next slide. You go to the next slide, Dan. Dan, are you there? Hello. All Heart of the continent. Yeah, there we go. Okay, that's good right there. Lake Superior to Manitoba. Okay, that's we're back at Muskoka. Muskoka is known for its many waterfalls, not just the multi-million-dollar cottages, but some beautiful rivers as well. Lake Superior to Manitoba. We were asked by the Trans-Canada Trail people to north or from Thunder Bay to the Manitoba border. And once we designed a route, mapped it out, it turned out to be 1,250 kilometers because no canoe route, it was a 4-year project for us to map out the quintessential Canadian canoe route. That was part of our national trail system. Next slide, Dan, if you can get it. So heart of the continent, as you can see, it's almost centrally located in actually North America. The canoe trails, okay, we're flipping through it fast here. You can see that it was mapped out. Okay, we're going all over the place here. Okay, you can see the extent of it was actually almost 25% of the total Trans-Canada Trail in Ontario, province of Ontario. And what I liked about the project, but not the fact that that it was part of the trail, I didn't really have much involvement with the Trans-Canada Trail because I thought it was just a TVs and snowmobiles. It wasn't what I would call to the fact that our first trail, the Onagum, as Northwest Ontario, the Onagum in this area is just full of archaeology and sites that date back hundreds and hundreds of years, far beyond the first explorers to this country. And it was a real pleasure mapping out. We didn't one thing that we don't do in our guide, sensitive places. We'll say that perhaps you might find some pictographs along this route, but we don't actually pinpoint any location unless it's already been located on government maps. That's very important to us as well. Next slide, Dan. So it's broken down into 7 different sections because it's really a number of different trails, water trails, from Lake Superior all the way to Manitoba. Some of the rivers of note, certainly the Boundary Waters route through Quetico, the Gunflint route, which is a heritage river, and a waterway, Laveron Waterway Park along the Pigeon River through route map number 6, Atikokan River up into the Seine River through Quetico, and then certainly ending up at the Winnipeg River and into White Shell Provincial Park. A lot of small rivers, and I won't say that Winnipeg River is very small. It's quite a massive amount of water going through that waterway. Next slide, Dan, thanks. Just an example of the maps in the book for one of the trail sections. This is the first section that we did. Actually, when I first started the project, I took a small container of water and went to Shoal Lake Reserve and got permission from the Anishinaabe to travel the waterways through there, and just we had a meeting with the elders to ask permission to actually be working on this project in their territory. And we were received with, I would say, supportive, I'd say with some support, not all support. It's always going to be it seems like a work in progress working with First Nations, but they were very receptive to the work that I was personally doing. And that made it easier for me to map this. So one thing that I do, this route through their territory, I suggest that people get permission from the band first before they actually put a paddle in the water. Next slide, please, Dan. A lot of these projects entail portage work, and either finding the old portages or blazing new trails through sometimes difficult areas. And for the Trans-Canada Trail, we did have to create some new trails, new campsites, and just to make sure that people, once the guidebook came out, that people could actually find the trails. Then we're traveling with a pair of loppers and a saw, no chainsaws, but everything's done by hand. Just a lot of sweat equity goes into these mapping projects. Next, everything's monitored, logged, journaled, GPSed, and just taking notes. Spent a lot of times just traveling, certainly not in a straight course. We're zigzagging across lakes, looking at using what reference material we have, and trying to make one of our goals is to make these guidebooks as accurate as possible and true to I think the essence of the landscape and to our First Peoples, and the fact that we're traveling on 1,000-year-old Muskoka routes, something that we always have to keep in mind. Next slide. So interesting to note on trails like the border route from along the Pigeon River, for example. On the American side, you don't really get the notion that you're traveling along an international border, except for some of the cairns on the portages. American side, it's the Lake Superior Provincial Forest, and the campsites and portage are in immaculate shape. Portages on the Canadian side, which is, we've also branded this route as a Voyageur route, a heritage river, and a waterway provincial park. And none of the portages had been cleared for decades. None of the campsites had been really well used or maintained. It was a bit disheartening seeing how well the United States kept their and pride in their trail systems and campsites. Next slide, Dan, thanks. Just looking across South Fowl Lake, and just the environment along the Pigeon River route, the Boundary Waters area. Just you almost think that you're in a different country and not in Ontario. Although if you've traveled around Thunder Bay, this landscape would be familiar to you. Next slide, Dan, thanks. Certainly we get caught up in the fun on the rivers. I mean, certainly the adrenaline rush, and we spend a lot of time charting out rapid diagrams. Most importantly is the portage information, because a lot of these rivers fluctuate, as people know, and are on all of these rapids. There's usually a high water and a low water takeout point, which is important for establishing a safe guidebook for paddlers. But still, the emphasis on all my books was an environmental purpose, and that was to protect these waterways through use. Next slide, Dan, please. Seasonal opportunities to get out early, travel some of these rivers and places in all seasons, pretty much. And that's because each season, as we all know, have different personalities, and as a photographer and artist, I really enjoy the challenges and the opportunities that each season presents. Next slide, Dan, please. I'm not alone on these projects too. I often do travel alone, but I really enjoy traveling with my family. My wife Andrea on the left side and my daughter Alexa on the right. And of course, Oben the Wonder Dog, our collie, gets the free ride. So it's nice to make a lot of these adventure trips, like a family outing. It's hard work, but we take time and to explore and just enjoy the rapture of the beauty of place along these routes that we explore. Next slide, Dan, thanks. We included kayak routes, certainly Georgian Bay, classic kayakable waters. Stand-up paddle boards now are getting more use as a way of traveling on some of these remote places. I see more people portaging stand-up paddle boards now, running rapids and stand-up paddle boards, and there's a resurgence of canoe tripping, really, as over the years it kind of taken a slump, and then the last few years it's risen in popularity once again. Next slide, Dan, thanks. So beautiful places. Obviously, one of the I would say the benefits of travel is the beauty of all our river systems, and it really boils down to a lifestyle that I've personally chosen, probably because of the fact that I'm not corporate material. Never, I wouldn't last long in that mainstream, but certainly feel very fortunate that I had this opportunity to take this path and enjoy the work that I do, mapping out wild rivers. Next slide, Dan. And the next slide too. I think these are just scenery shots. We're looking at Quetico Park, a lot like Temagami, a lot of similarities across the Canadian Shield. This is part of the Trans-Canada Trail route, water route. Next slide. Whenever you get a calm day on a big lake, it's always a treat. Next slide. I'm not sure if that's it, but I think that might be it for the slideshow. Any questions out there?
I have. Yeah, there's a couple of questions from the audience. Also, I had a couple as well. Also a comment. My nephew in Minneapolis worked for the Minnesota State Parks folks for a summer. Young 17-year-old or 18-year-old guy up maintaining trails near the Canadian border. So I'll pass on your compliments about the portages and the trails they have up there in the state park to him, to my nephew Luke. A couple questions. One was, what was the most dangerous river that you have ever traveled on?
I would say I've had some hair-raising trips. I wrote about it in one of them, River of Fire, certainly on the Seal River, during very high water, and just a true adventure story that I wrote about. It took me a while to get that one out because it was there's a lot that it entails, not just the dangers regarding a river in flood, but also the biggest wildfires in Manitoba history we had to paddle through, plus polar bear country. I had an assistant guide that went awry, that kind of thing. So that all, add that all up, and it's one of the most, I guess, perilous situations that I've been in. And I remember doing all the canyons on the Coppermine River, where most people portage. We opted to actually tie our two canoes together and run all the canyons. It was a bit hair-raising at the time. I think I've become more careful over the years, though. we don't override our experience or skill levels. And I think that's one of the faux pas of today's paneling crowd, is that they'll tackle rivers and routes way above their experience level. And that's, often creates a lot of problems.
Yeah, another question was, if you were, excuse me, if you were to pick out the most beautiful river in Ontario to paddle on, which one would you pick?
Well, I'm partial to Lady Evelyn because I've paddled that probably well over 200 times, up and down at night, all seasons practically, snowshoed it in winter. I'm a little biased in that sense. We are, our eco lodge is on the Lady Evelyn River, so we spend a lot of time up there, and it's a river that you can paddle up or down numerous times and not get tired of it. It's really hard to say. I mean, there's rivers in Muskoka here, the small rivers like the Shadow River, the Dee River, beautiful small rivers you can do in an afternoon. The most beautiful rivers, every river to me is beautiful. It has its, different moments. The Shield rivers, Quetico is a lot like Temagami. One of my favorites too, it has to be the Mattawa River. The historic Mattawa River. I've done that race, North Bay to Mattawa, over a dozen times. And I think I've paddled it over 20 times. That's one of the prettiest short rivers. You can do that in 2 or 3 days. Easy shuttling from North Bay to Mattawa. But I would say that should be on a bucket list for most people. It's not overdeveloped. It's developed, but there are campsites all along the way. And you get the Laurentian landscape, and you also have the history and the prehistory there. You've got Port de l'Enfait, which is an ochre mine used by the Nipissing First Nations as a trade item, feared by the voyageurs, and certainly the voyageur traffic. It's one of the oldest traveled rivers in the country. The Mattawa was part of the fur trade route. So that, along with the French River, I think would be a must for most people.
A couple other questions. Did you do most of the drawing that are in your guidebooks?
I do all the artwork, yes.
Okay. And Franco in Sudbury was curious about where to purchase your books. I know in the previous webinar we said you published, I think, 15 or 16 books.
Well, yeah.
Where would people buy those?
Well, I'm glad you asked. My last 2 publications already, and you go to hapwilson.com. We have an online store there. We personalize the books as they go out. This is a historic novel. It's really getting a lot of good press and reviews. It's about the Hornby expedition, 1926. If you like that type of real life story, I've added dialogue to the characters, and if you like Canadian history, that's must. I'm really excited about this book. It's the first fictional novel, and it's kind of a dystopian type of. There's no zombies in this book, but I think there's a lot of. It's almost like written as a wilderness survival manual in case the infrastructure fails, and we're left to survive by any means. So it's 25 years in the writing for this one, and it just came out last week. But people want to order any of the guidebooks. There's 14 books now, and also I think I've had a lot of my art, which is on the online store. Limited edition prints. Just go to hapwilson.com and go to the shop icon. Be happy to send out your Christmas presents.
That's great. I had a couple of questions to ask, but actually we've had a number as well. I think Jeff added a question. What was your most memorable wildlife encounter when you were out on the trails researching your books?
Where was it? Yeah. I would have to say, well, I've been chased by musk oxen in the territories. We've had an incident with polar bears. I think mapping out the Trans-Canada Trail just outside of Thunder Bay, I know I was using my mountain bike I'd canoe to a certain section, then I'd ride my mountain bike back to my vehicle. And I remember going on this logging road, and there were a lot of bear sign, and this one bear was on the laneway, And I stopped and got off my bike, and then he didn't charge, but he was coming right at me. So I picked up my bike and I just shook it at him. And I said, booga booga, or just yelled at him, and then chased him a bit with my bike, waving my bike in the air. And he didn't really run away. He just kind of ambled off. It's not unusual. I homesteaded in bear country for many years and had a lot of bear incidents. So it's a matter of just, who's going to out bluff who. I actually wrestled a moose in Muskoka here. My neighbor, I basically took it by the antlers, but I was pressed up against the garage next door. Neighbor had called we live right next to a wildlife sanctuary, and our neighbor called the wildlife sanctuary and myself. I went down and kind of got pinned against the garage, their garage wall. And I was hand wrestling with this young bull moose. And it was during the rut season. And Tony, he was a large fellow that was looking after the sanctuary. He said, well, I'm going to try this. So he started walking away. Well, just to let you know that he had just been in the compound with a female cow moose and had just finished feeding it. So he's got the aroma of cow moose all over him. So the bull moose let go of me and then went over to Tony and followed him the 1.5 kilometers over pretty rough terrain all the way back to the sanctuary. And he ended up putting it in the compound. I went over to Tony and asked, later, and I said, look, that's got to be a released moose from the sanctuary. And he said, no, we've never seen that moose before. So I would have to say that was one of the more tense moments with wildlife, is actually feeling the strength of that bull moose, who could have, pushed me through the wall of that garage at any moment, and just toying with me while we're doing this little wrestling match. That was a bit frightening.
I'll give the final question to Brian and Jan, who had a question about what's your feeling on the current status of protecting Temagami?
Yeah, sorry, we answered that in the last webinar, Brian. No, it's at a bit of a stalemate, because we did put a package together. I only mapped it out for our group, Earth Roots, and we presented, and they were looking, I think Ford had this notion that, there's money in parks. Maybe we can expand the parks system and make more, put more money in the Ontario coffers. So all the agencies banded together and put in suggestions for expanded park systems. We did that for Temagami in one of the big donut holes, the Solace Wildlands, which would protect 3 really sensitive river systems, small rivers, but very critical to coming out of the Rock Knob uplands and the old growth forest of the core area of Temagami. That's sitting on a back burner, as most of the environmental issues are in this province with the current administration. So it's we're just waiting for the next election. That's all we can do, because we're our hands are tied, and I think most environment groups, conservation groups, will agree that our hands are tied behind our backs right now.
Okay, thank you. It's just a little after 3 o'clock, so I do want to give people back the rest of their afternoon. Thanks so much for everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon at another Ontario Nature event or webinar. Hap, these 2 webinars that you've presented at and that I've had the privilege to host were really informative for me. I learned an awful lot. I want to explore rivers north of Huntsville now. So that's a motivation to me and Karen to get up north and explore more of the province than we have so far. A reminder to everybody, you can check for details of upcoming events, either online or in person, with Ontario Nature at our website as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of the season. Enjoy some of the winter weather that's coming our way, and in the spring get a chance to explore some of these great rivers that Hap told us about today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan, and Ontario Nature, and everybody that joined us in this webinar. And yes, have a safe and happy Christmas and winter. And hopefully we'll see you on the river in the springtime.